Late at night, on June 18th, 1944, a message came up to the flag bridge of the cruiser Indianapolis, somewhere in the black water of the Philippine Sea. It was a request. Vice Admiral Mark Mitscher wanted permission to turn Task Force 58 west and run hard through the darkness, so that when the sun came up, he would be close enough to kill the Japanese carriers. Every aviator in the Pacific Fleet would have said yes. It was the aggressive answer. It was the answer that wins medals. Admiral Raymond Spruance had about 1 hour to decide. Somewhere out in that same darkness, a Japanese admiral named Ozawa Jisaburo was waiting for exactly that. Every ship he had, every aircraft, every trained pilot the Empire of Japan had left, all of it rested on a single assumption. The American would come west. Ozawa had built a trap so elegant that the only way through it was to refuse to walk in. Spruance said no. They called him a coward for it. Within weeks, a senior American admiral would put a written demand on Nimitz's desk, asking that Spruance be fired, and Spruance would never explain himself, not that night, not after the war, not once, for the rest of his life. But the one man who understood what he had done was not wearing an American uniform. He was on the other side of that ocean, watching his aircraft fly away and never come back. I'm glad you're here today. What state are you watching from? To understand what happened on that bridge, you have to understand what was sitting on the beach behind him. Saipan, June of 1944, 12 miles of volcanic rock and sugarcane in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. And by the 18th of that month, more than 70,000 American soldiers and Marines were ashore on it. They had come across the reef under mortar fire. The Amtraks had crawled up out of the water into a beach already registered by Japanese gunners who had spent months measuring every yard of that sand and marking it on their maps. Men went down before the ramps dropped. The ones who made it dug into coral that turned entrenching tools into scrap metal, and they lay there through a first night none of them ever forgot, listening to the sugarcane move in the dark and trying to decide whether it was the wind. The smell of the place stayed with the survivors for 50 years. Burned fuel, cordite, cane smoke, and under all of it, in the heat, the sweet, heavy rot of the dead who had not been collected yet, on both sides, because nobody could stand up long enough to collect them. By the 18th, those men were still fighting for the high ground, and behind them, riding at anchor in open water, sat the transports. That word does not sound like much. Transports, it sounds like paperwork, like cargo, like something a supply officer worries about. It was not. Those ships held the ammunition. Those men would fire tomorrow. The water they would drink, the plasma that would keep the wounded ones alive until the hospital ships came, the shells for the artillery, the food, every single thing that made those 70,000 men an army instead of 70,000 stranded human beings on a rock. They could not leave. There was no airfield yet. There was no port. There was no road home. If the transports burned, the men on the beach did not retreat because there was nowhere to retreat to. They died there slowly. Over weeks, in front of newsreel cameras, if anyone was still alive to run the cameras. The Japanese knew this. So did the man in the flag plot of the Indianapolis. His name was Raymond Spruance, and he was 57 years old. He was a small, weathered, unhurried man. He walked for miles every day, around and around the deck. If that was all the deck there was, because walking was how he thought. He ate plainly, and at the same hours, he went to bed early and he slept, which is a stranger thing than it sounds when you consider what he was carrying. He wore no expression that told you anything, and he said as little as a human being can say and still command a fleet. He had spent his career in destroyers and cruisers and battleships. The slow world, the gun world, steel against steel, over open sights, at ranges where you could see the ship that was trying to kill you. He had never flown an airplane in his life. He was not a pilot. He had never been a pilot. And now he commanded the largest concentration of aircraft carriers ever assembled by any nation in the history of the world. The men who flew off those carriers knew it. They talked about it. There was another admiral in the Pacific, and if you were an American in 1944, you knew his name, William Halsey. Bull Halsey, he was on the cover of the magazines. His face was on recruiting posters. He said things reporters could print, hard things, quotable things. The kind of line a man in a barber shop in Ohio could repeat to his neighbor. Halsey was made for the war, the public could see. Spruance was made for something else. Reporters came to him. They sat down across from him, and they asked their questions. And he answered in as few words as the question allowed. And then he stopped talking. He did not fill the silence. He waited. Eventually, they ran out of questions and went away with nothing worth printing. There was nothing wrong with him socially. This was deliberate. He had thought it through the way he thought everything through, and he had concluded that a man who becomes aware of his own reputation begins without ever deciding to make decisions that protect it. So he refused to have one. Think about what that cost. A man, every officer in that ocean was building a name. Spruance was the only one actively tearing his down on purpose, because he had decided that a reputation was a weight on the scale, and he wanted the scale clean. It would nearly destroy him. And it is the only reason he was able to do what he did on the night of the 18th. Here is the part almost nobody knows. Raymond Spruance should not have been in the Pacific War at all. Not in the way he was. Not in command of carriers. He got there because another man got sick. In May of 1942, Halsey came off the line with a skin condition so severe he could not function. Dermatitis. He could not sleep. He could not stand his own uniform against his skin. They put him in a hospital bed at Pearl Harbor, and he lay there knowing that the most important naval operation the United States had planned since the war began was about to happen without him. Nimitz needed a carrier commander in days, and Halsey, flat on his back, gave him a name, not a pilot, not one of the aviation men. He named Raymond Spruance, a cruiser admiral who had been screening for him, a man who had never commanded a carrier task force in his life. He named him because he had worked beside him for months and had come to trust his judgment more than any other officer he could think of. That is the whole reason. One sick man's opinion, offered from a hospital bed, that is the thread the entire Pacific hangs from. So Spruance walked onto the flag bridge of the Enterprise and inherited Halsey's staff, men who had not picked him, men who had watched Halsey do it the loud way and liked it. They looked at this quiet cruiser officer and they waited to see what he was. On the morning of June 4th, 1942, he showed them. He launched his dive bombers at a range that left almost nothing in the tanks. It was a gamble on arithmetic, and it was done in silence on a chart table by a man with a pair of dividers and a pencil. There was no radar picture of the enemy. There was no certainty of any kind. There was a position report, a course, a speed, and a guess about what a Japanese admiral would be doing with his flight deck at a particular hour of a particular morning. If Spruance was wrong about where those carriers were, if he was wrong by very much at all, his aircraft would fly out to the edge of their range, find empty ocean, turn for home on fumes, and fall into the sea one by one with the young men still strapped inside them. He was gambling the entire striking power of the United States Navy in the Pacific on his own reading of a clock, on the belief that Nagumo would be caught in the middle of rearming, decks full, fuel lines open, bombs stacked where bombs should never be stacked. He was right. By that afternoon, 4 Japanese fleet carriers were burning Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu. The strike force that had hit Pearl Harbor, that had run wild across the Indian Ocean, that had been the most powerful naval formation on the planet, was gone in a single day. And then, that night, Spruance did the thing they never forgave him for. The Japanese carriers were dead, but the Japanese fleet was not. Out there in the dark to the west were battleships, cruisers, destroyers, Yamamoto's main body, still coming, and the natural thing, the thing every fighting man on that bridge wanted, was to go west and finish it, chase them down, sink the rest, and Spruance turned east, away. His own staff argued. The word went around the fleet within days, and it was not a kind word, too cautious, timid. He had 4 carriers on the bottom and a broken enemy in front of him, and he walked away from the kill. He offered no explanation. He did not defend himself. He did not say one word in his own defense to any man on that ship. He went back to work. Here is what nobody on that bridge knew, and what Spruance himself could not have known with certainty. Yamamoto had sent his surface forces east that night for one purpose: to find the American carriers in the dark and destroy them in a night gun action, battleships and heavy cruisers against carriers with no aircraft in the air. In blackness, where American radar advantage meant less, and Japanese night gunnery and torpedoes meant everything. If Spruance had gone west, he would have run straight into the guns of the Imperial Japanese Navy at close range with nothing to fight back with. The decision that made them call him timid was the decision that saved the American carrier fleet. He never said so. He never told the critics. He never wrote a single word to correct the record. Not in 1942. Not in the 30 years he had left. 2 years passed. He got his stars. He got the 5th Fleet. He took Tarawa. He took the Marshalls. And in June of 1944, he was standing on the bridge of the Indianapolis, taking the Marianas with 70,000 men on a beach behind him, and the same accusation waiting for him in the dark, word for word, exactly the same as the last one. Only this time it was different in one respect. This time, the enemy had already built his entire battle around the assumption that Raymond Spruance would come to him. The man building that assumption was, in almost every way that mattered, Raymond Spruance's reflection in a dark mirror. Ozawa Jisaburo was born in the same year as Spruance, 1886. He was 57 years old in June of 1944. The same as the American. He was tall for a Japanese officer of his generation, and famously plain-looking, and men who served under him described him the way men described Spruance, as cold, precisi, undramatic, a man who did not raise his voice because he had never needed to. He was the Imperial Japanese Navy's finest mind on carrier warfare. He had argued for years against a battleship establishment that did not want to hear it, that the aircraft carrier was now the capital ship, and everything else in the fleet existed to serve it. He had been right, and like Spruance, he had never flown an airplane in his life. He had learned carrier war the way a man learns mathematics, from first principles on paper in silence. So men, the same age, the same temperament, the same blind spot in their flying logbooks, sitting on opposite sides of one ocean, each about to bet everything on what the other one would do. The difference was not intelligence. Both were serious men. The difference was what their navies had asked of them. Ozawa's plan had a name, Operation A, go, and you need to understand it, because the plan is the whole story. He was not deluded about the numbers. He knew exactly what he was facing. 9 Japanese carriers against 15 American ones. Roughly 430 aircraft against something close to 900. On any honest accounting, he should have stayed in port. He was outnumbered better than 2 to 1 in the only currency that mattered, So he decided not to fight that battle at all. He decided to fight a different one and win it with geometry. Here was the key. Japanese carrier aircraft were built light. They carried less armor, less protection, less weight of everything that keeps a pilot alive, and in exchange they carried fuel and they could fly. A Japanese strike could reach out past 300 miles. An American strike loaded with enough margin to get home was good for about 200. Look at those two numbers and you can see the entire battle. If Ozawa could hold his fleet somewhere in that gap out past 300 miles, then he could launch. And the Americans could not, he could hit them and they could not hit back. Not because his ships were better, not because his men were braver, because of 100 miles of empty air that his aircraft could cross and theirs could not. He would fight the Americans from a place where they were physically unable to reach him. They called it outranging. It is one of the most elegant ideas any admiral produced in that entire war. And it cost nothing but patience. But Ozawa was not finished because the outranging idea had one flaw, and he had already solved it. The flaw was this. If you launch from 300 and some miles out, your aircraft arrive over the enemy fleet with their tanks half empty. They have one pass, and then they have to turn around and come all the way home. One strike, then hours of nothing while they land, refuel, rearm, against 15 American carriers. One strike was not going to be enough unless they did not have to come home. Look at the map. Guam, Rota, Tinian, Japanese islands with Japanese airfields sitting right behind the American fleet. So the plan became this. His aircraft would launch from 300 miles west. They would fly to the American carriers. They would attack, and then instead of turning back, they would keep going east over the American fleet and land on Guam, Fuel, bombs up again, and on the way back to their own carriers, they would hit the Americans a second time. Every plane, 2 strikes, and Task Force 58 caught in the middle, being hit from both directions by an enemy. It could not reach in either one. They called it shuttle bombing. American admirals had been having nightmares about it for a year. It was, on paper, close to perfect, and every piece of it, the geometry, the shuttle, the bait, all of it depended on one thing. The American fleet had to come west. That was not a hope. That was the load-bearing wall of the entire operation. Ozawa needed Task Force 58 to move toward him into the range band he had chosen so that he could sit out past the edge of it and work. If the Americans stayed east, close to Saipan, sitting still, the whole beautiful machine would not turn. He would be a fleet with long arms and nothing in reach. So why did Ozawa build his greatest battle? The last real battle the Imperial Japanese Navy would ever fight, on the assumption that the American admiral would come to him, because every American admiral always had. That is the thing people miss. Ozawa was not guessing. He was reading a record. Since Coral Sea, since Midway, since Guadalcanal, since every carrier action of the entire war, the pattern had been the same. Find the enemy carriers, go at them, kill them. That was American doctrine. That was American temperament. That was what the aviators wanted and what the aviators got. Halsey had done it. Everyone had done it. It was not a bad bet. It was the safest bet a man could make with the information available. And Ozawa put every ship he had on it. He got the logic exactly right. He got the man exactly wrong. But before we get to that room on the Indianapolis, there is something else you have to know. Because while Ozawa was steaming east with his beautiful plan, 3 things had already happened that had killed it. and he did not know about a single one of them. The first was the pilots. The men who flew off Ozawa's carriers in June of 1944 were not the men who had flown off Nagumo's carriers at Pearl Harbor. Those men were dead. They had died at Coral Sea and Midway and in the long grinding meat grinder over the Solomons. Hundreds of them, the best naval aviators in the world. Some of them with 1,000 hours before the war even started. Japan had not replaced them. Japan could not replace them. The training pipeline that had produced those men was built to produce a small number of superb pilots slowly, and when the war ate them faster than it could make them, it did not adapt. It just kept going, and it lowered the standard, and it shortened the course. The young men sitting in those cockpits had a few months of flying. Some of them had barely landed on a moving deck. Some of them had never done it at night. They had been taught to take off, to fly straight, to aim, and to do well, and there had not been time for much else. They were brave. Every account of that morning agrees on it, including the American ones, including the ones written by the men who shot them down. They came on in formation. They did not break. They flew into it. Think about what was being asked of those boys. 300 miles over open water, in a cockpit with no armor plate behind the seat and no rubber in the fuel tanks, at the outside edge of their range, to find a fleet they had never seen, attack it through more anti-aircraft fire than had ever been concentrated in one place in the history of the world, and then keep flying east and find one small island in a very large ocean on fumes. With the sun going down, veterans could not have done it. That is the point that has to land. Men with 1,000 hours would have found it close to impossible. The men waiting for them had 2 years of training and hundreds of hours in combat behind them, sitting in an aircraft that was faster, tougher, better armed, and built with the assumption that the pilot inside it was worth bringing home. Ozawa's plan required master pilots. He had children, and he did not know it, because the paperwork on his desk said the air groups were ready, and in that Navy, the paperwork had stopped telling the truth a long time ago. The second thing was Guam. Remember, half of the shuttle depended on those airfields. Lente, fuel, rearm, go again. Ozawa believed those fields were intact and that hundreds of land-based aircraft were waiting there to join him. They were not. American carrier aircraft had been over those islands for days already. Methodically, the way you would clear a room, the runways were cratered, the revetments were burned. The land-based Air Force Ozawa was counting on had largely been destroyed on the ground before his ships were within 400 miles of it. The airfields his pilots were going to land on had been erased. Nobody told him. The reports coming back to him said what reports in that Navy had said for 2 years, which was what headquarters wanted to hear. And the third thing was, in the American magazines, the Americans had a new kind of shell. It carried a tiny radio inside the fuse, and that radio listened for its own signal bouncing off an airplane. And when the airplane got close enough, the shell exploded on its own. It did not have to hit anything. It just had to get near. For 20 years, anti-aircraft gunnery had been an exercise in near misses. Now the near miss was enough. Ozawa had never heard of it. Nobody had told him because nobody on his side knew. So look at what is actually out there in the dark on the night of June 18th. A brilliant plan, correct in all of its arithmetic, resting on green pilots who could not execute it. Staging through airfields that no longer existed. Flying into a wall of shells that did not need to hit them. The trap was already dead. Ozawa was going to spend the last carrier Air Force Japan would ever have proving it. And Raymond Spruance did not know any of that either. What Spruance had was a red leather folder on the last day of March, 1944. 2 Japanese flying boats left Palau, carrying the commander-in-chief of the combined fleet and his chief of staff, They flew into a tropical storm over the Philippines. One went down and was never found. The other, carrying Vice Admiral Fukudome, came down in the water off Cebu, and Fukudome swam out of it and was picked up by Filipino fishermen and handed to the guerrillas. But something else came out of that airplane. A wooden box floated ashore. Fishermen pulled it out of the surf the next morning. The way men who work the water have pulled things out of the water, since there have been men in water, they opened it on the sand. Inside, dry, was a bound document in a red leather portfolio with a single letter on the cover, Z. Those fishermen could not read one character of it. They understood anyway. You did not have to read Japanese to understand that a red leather folder that came out of an admiral's airplane was worth something to somebody. What they did next is one of the quiet acts of courage of the entire Pacific War, and almost nobody in America has ever heard about it. They gave it to the guerrillas, and the guerrillas hid it and moved it and kept it on an island crawling with Japanese soldiers who were at that moment tearing the place apart, looking for exactly that box. Burning villages, taking hostages, doing what that army did when it wanted something. Men died keeping that folder. Not one of them ever knew what was in it. On the 11th of May, an American submarine, the Creval, surfaced off Negros in the dark and took the package aboard. She carried it to Darwin. It reached Australia on the 19th of May. Translators went to work. It was the Japanese Naval War Plan. And then those pages did something remarkable. They went back out to sea. Copies were run off and sent to every flag officer connected with the coming invasion of the Marianas, and a flying boat carried a copy out to the fleet at Eniwetok on June 8th, 1944. That translation was placed in the hands of Raymond Spruance 10 days before Mitscher's request came up to the bridge. Spruance had been handed the enemy's own doctrine, in the enemy's own words, translated into English, and what it described was not a straightforward carrier duel. It described the way that Navy thought: decoys, befforce, divided fleets, the idea written down in their own operational language that you show the enemy one force to pull him where you want him, while another force does the real work somewhere he is not looking. So on the night of the 18th, when Spruance stood there with 70,000 men on the beach behind him and a Japanese fleet somewhere to the west, he was not being timid. He was not being cautious out of temperament. He had read what these people did in their own handwriting. 10 days earlier, shortly before midnight, Nimitz relayed a radio direction, finding Fix, Ozawa's fleet, somewhere around 355 miles to the west, southwest. And a report came in from the submarine Stingray that made the picture worse instead of better, because it suggested the Japanese might be further east than the Fix said, which meant Spruance was now looking at a plot with two possible enemies on it, the one he could see and the one the arithmetic did not quite account for at 23:25. Mitscher's message reached the flag bridge of the Indianapolis, turn west at 0130, run through the night, be in position at 0500 and hit him at first light. And here is the part that gets lost in the retelling. Mitscher was right. Tactically, professionally, by every standard of the trade, the man was right. The Japanese would still be outside American strike range in the morning, but the gap would be closed, and the first blow of the day would be American instead of Japanese. Spruance knew it. He said so himself. Later, in writing, as a matter of tactics, he wrote, going out after the Japanese and knocking their carriers out would have been much better and more satisfactory than waiting for them to attack us. He knew what the better answer was. Now, he had about an hour. Arleigh Burke was 42 years old, Mitscher's chief of staff, a destroyer man who would one day run the entire United States Navy. He was waiting on the result, and he understood the arithmetic as well as anyone alive. He put it plainly afterward. They knew they were going to have hell slugged out of them in the morning, and they knew they could not reach the enemy to stop it. That is what the choice actually was. Not caution against courage. Spruance's choice was to stand still and take 430 aircraft on the chin, on purpose, with no ability to hit back, and to do it while every man on every bridge in that fleet believed he was doing it out of fear. He sat with the message, picture that room. It is past midnight. The flag plot is red lit and close and smells of coffee and cigarettes and hot electrical equipment. There is a chart on the table with a pencil mark on it. West-southwest, 355 miles. And everyone in the compartment has been staring at that mark for an hour. The talkers are quiet. The staff is watching him and pretending not to. And Spruance is doing what Spruance always did, which is nothing that looks like anything. No pacing, no speech. A small man in khakis sitting with a piece of paper in a silence that got heavier. Every minute it went on. Nobody in that flag plot agreed with him. Not one man understand who these people were. These were not fools. These were not timid men or careerists or headquarters officers. They were the finest carrier professionals the United States of America had produced in 2.5 years of the hardest naval war ever fought. And every single one of them wanted to go west, and every single one of them was going to be told no by a cruiser sailor who had never flown an airplane. And he was not going to explain himself in any way that would satisfy a single one of them. He knew that too. That is the part that ought to sit with you. He knew exactly how it was going to look. He knew what they would say in the ready rooms, and he knew it would follow him. And he did the arithmetic on that the same way he did the arithmetic on everything, and he decided it did not weigh anything, because the reason could not be proven at midnight. The reason was not on the chart. The reason was 70,000 men on a beach they could not leave, who could not swim home. He wrote it down himself, years later, in the plainest sentence he ever produced about that night. We were at the start of a very important and large amphibious operation, and we could not afford to gamble and place it in jeopardy. At 0038, his Ignalit Mitscher, end run by other carrier groups, remains possibility and must not be overlooked. That was it. That was the whole answer. No explanation, no apology, no invitation to discuss it further. 12 words of naval English, and Task Force 58 stayed where it was on the other side of that water just after midnight. Ozawa sent his own signal to his fleet. This operation has an immense bearing on the fate of the empire. It is hoped that all forces will do their utmost. He was already where he needed to be. One of his division commanders, Obayashi, had actually begun putting fighters into the air that evening after a contact came in. And Ozawa had told him to stop. There was no hurry. Do it properly tomorrow. Do it the way we planned it. He went to sleep. If he slept, believing the Task Force 58 was at that moment steaming toward him through the darkness. Everything he had done for the last week assumed it. His fuel state assumed it. His launch schedule assumed it. His position assumed it. Task Force 58 was not moving. It was sitting still east of Saipan, between the enemy and the beach, exactly where it had been. Radar turning, Hellcats fueled and spotted, pilots asleep in their bunks with the best night's rest any of them would get for a month. Ozawa would not learn any of this until his aircraft were already in the air and there was no longer any way to call them back. At dawn on June 19th, the American radar screens began to fill, not with contacts, with a stain, a mass of returns bleeding across the western edge of the scope. More aircraft than most of those operators had ever seen at one time in their life. More than they had been trained to count. One of them called it in and then called it in again. because the first report sounded like a malfunction. Well over 100 miles out, holding formation and coming straight in, Ozawa's trap was closing exactly as he had drawn it. The geometry was perfect, the range was perfect. Everything the man had planned for a year was happening on schedule. And it was landing on a fleet that had not moved an inch, that had been awake and waiting for it since before the sky turned gray. With radar up and every gun manned and shells in the ready racks that did not need to hit anything at all. The Hellcats were already climbing. What happened next was not a battle. It was arithmetic being paid out. The Hellcats met them a long way out with altitude and speed and the sun, and they went through those formations. The way a saw goes through green wood, the Japanese pilots did what they had been taught, which was to hold formation and press on. And holding formation is exactly the wrong thing to do when the man above you has a better airplane and knows how to use it. They came apart in the air, they went into the sea in ones and twos, and then in numbers that stopped, meaning anything to the men watching. The ones that got through the fighters found the ships, and the ships were waiting with those new shells, the ones that did not need to hit, and the sky over Task Force 58 turned into something no pilot in history had ever flown through, and few survived 4 waves all morning. All afternoon, one American pilot, watching another formation come apart above him, set it into his radio without thinking much about it. It was like an old-time turkey shoot back home. The name stuck to that day forever. It was not a boast. It was just accurate. And while it was happening, underneath all of it, the American submarines were doing the quiet work. The Albacore put a torpedo into the Taiho. She was Ozawa's flagship, the newest carrier in the Imperial Japanese Navy, armored flight deck, built specifically to survive exactly this. One hit, it should not have been fatal. And it was not for hours. What killed her was gasoline vapor, spreading through her hull from a ruptured tank while damage control did the wrong thing with the ventilation, until the whole ship detonated from the inside and took most of her crew with her. The Kavala found the Shakaku. She was a veteran, one of the Pearl Harbor carriers, one of the last of them. She burned and blew up and went down. Both of them, on the same day, Ozawa transferred his flag and kept fighting because there was nothing else to do. The next evening, Mitscher finally got what he had asked for. He found the Japanese fleet late in the day, and he launched at extreme range, knowing his people would be coming home in darkness, and he sank the carrier. Hio, and then his aircraft came back over an ocean they could not see, out of fuel. In the black, so Mitscher turned on the lights. Every ship in Task Force 58, in enemy waters, with submarines around, lit up, deck lights, searchlights pointed straight up, star shells. Anything that would burn, he put the whole fleet on display to bring his boys home. Some of them made it. About 80 aircraft did not, and went into the water, and most of those crews were pulled out over the following days. When it ended, roughly 600 Japanese aircraft were gone. The Americans had lost around 125, and the majority of those were not lost to the enemy at all. They were lost to the dark. And the fuel gauge on the second night, Ozawa got away with 6 carriers. There's a line in his flag log from the end of the first day. Somebody wrote it down in the middle of everything, and it is the coldest sentence in the whole battle. Surviving carrier air power, 35 operational aircraft. He had started that morning with 430. He had 6 carriers and no Air Force ships with flight decks and nothing to put on them, and no pilots left alive to fly what he did not have. The carrier air arm of the Empire of Japan, the force that had crossed the Pacific and burned Pearl Harbor and terrified the world, had ceased to exist in about 2 days. And it had done so under an admiral who had planned better than anyone on the other side. Ozawa offered his resignation Toyota refused it and said the defeat was more his own fault than Ozawa. And in the American fleet, they were already sharpening the knife. Mitscher said it within days, privately, and it was all he needed to say. The enemy escaped. His fleet was not sunk. That was the verdict. It went through the ready rooms and the ward rooms and across the whole Pacific Fleet in a week. And it had a shape everyone recognized. This is what you get when you put a man who is not an aviator in command of carriers. Then John Towers went further. Towers was 59, Deputy Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, and one of the founding fathers of American naval aviation, a man with a legitimate claim to have built the arm that had just won the battle. He did not grumble at dinner. He put it in writing. He formally demanded that Nimitz relieve Raymond Spruance of command for mishandling Task Force 58 and letting the Japanese fleet escape, and in the same breath, he recommended himself as the replacement. Nimitz, read it. Nimitz said no. Nimitz said nothing publicly, and the paper went into a drawer, and the story went around the fleet anyway, because that kind of story always does. The following month, Ernest King came out to Saipan. King ran the entire United States Navy and was, by universal agreement, the hardest man in it. He went straight to Spruance and told him he had done a damn fine job, and that no matter what anybody else said to him, his decision had been correct. Spruance listened. He nodded. He said essentially nothing and went back to work and never mentioned it again. 4 months later, the argument settled itself. October, Leyte Gulf. Ozawa is back at sea, and this time he is not carrying a plan. He is carrying a corpse. Those 6 hollow carriers, the ones with no aircraft, steam north with one purpose in the world: to be seen, to appear on an American radar screen and be recognized as carriers so that the American fleet will chase them. That is the entire mission. They are bait, and every man aboard knows it, and they go anyway. William Halsey sees them. He does not deliberate. He takes his fast battleships and his carriers, and he goes north at full speed after the thing that had been put in front of him for exactly that purpose. He does not leave a covering force at San Bernardino Strait. He does not confirm that anyone else is covering it. And Kurita comes through that empty strait in the dark with Yamato and the heavy cruisers, what was left of the last real surface force Japan had after American aircraft had already taken Musashi away from him in the Philippine Sea the day before. And he comes out the other side, and the only thing standing between those battleships and the invasion shipping at Leyte is Taffy 3. Escort carriers built on merchant hulls, destroyers, destroyer escorts, little ships with little guns, throwing themselves at battleships at point-blank range in the most desperate surface action Americans fought in that entire war. Men died in the water for 2 days, waiting for a rescue that was slow in coming. In October, William Halsey did exactly what Ozawa's plan had needed Raymond Spruance to do in June. Nimitz sent a signal that day that men still, quote, "Where is Task Force 34? The world wonders. Nobody ever sent a message like that to Raymond Spruance. Ozawa never once said that Spruance had been right. There is no, quote, he gave interviews after the war. He discussed the battle, and he never praised the man. What he left instead was the plan, because think about what Operation Go actually is. As a document, it is a fleet action, the last one Japan would ever fight, designed from the first page around a prediction of how one specific enemy would behave under pressure. Ozawa staked every ship, every aircraft, every trained man his country had left on his reading of what the Americans would do when a Japanese fleet appeared 355 miles to the west. He was not dismissing his opponent. You do not build a battle around a man. You are not taking seriously. He read the logic perfectly. Every American admiral would have come west. He simply could not believe that any human being With a fleet at his fingertips and a beaten enemy in reach and glory on the table, and every officer under him begging to go, would stand still and hold to a mission he had been given, he did not underestimate Spruance's intelligence. He underestimated his consistency. After the war, Raymond Spruance ran the Naval War College. Then he was ambassador to the Philippines. Then he retired to Pebble Beach, California, and put on old khakis and work shoes and walked 8 or 10 miles along the coast every morning with his dog. He made his own hot chocolate. He worked in his garden. Reporters called sometimes, and he handled them the way he always had, which is to say they got nothing. He wrote no memoir. He gave no lectures about the war. He never corrected the record on Midway, and he never corrected it on the Philippine Sea. And when men who had been there wrote their books and got it wrong, he let them. When the fifth star went to Halsey instead of him, King had already written in his own memorandum that as to brains, Spruance was the best man. He recommended Halsey anyway. Because Halsey was senior, and because Carl Vinson, who ran the House Armed Services Committee, wanted Halsey, and because the newspapers loved Halsey, in December of 1945, that counted for more than any operational record. Spruance addressed it exactly once in a letter 20 years later. If he could have had the fifth star alongside Bill Halsey, he wrote, that would have been fine. But if he had received it instead of Halsey, he would have been very unhappy about it. That is not bitterness wearing a nice suit. That is a man who had made his peace with something most of us never manage, which is that being right and being known for being right are two entirely different things, and only one of them ever mattered. They tried again for him later. In 2001, a congressman from Indiana introduced a bill to advance him posthumously to Fleet Admiral. It went nowhere. The case was made again in print in recent years by serving officers on the evidence, on the record. It has never passed. He never got the rank because he was never the right kind of famous. He had understood that about himself long before anyone had the nerve to explain it to him. Raymond Spruance died in December of 1969. He is buried at Golden Gate National Cemetery in the same ground as Chester Nimitz. His own Navy called him timid twice, and both times he was right, and both times he kept his mouth shut about it. The only man who ever took his measure honestly, who studied him closely enough to bet an entire empire on understanding him, was the enemy admiral who lost